Welcome back to our second episode of Calamity Lore Bites. This episode is dedicated to the second yo-yo only video in which we defeated these three bosses. This episode will not be touching on Ilmaris or Desert Scourge for reasons I'll explain later in the video. Coincidentally, both of the bosses we will be touching on come from the same place. The evil biomes. We actually know what the evil biomes are from two different lore items that basically say the same exact thing, so I've just picked the cooler one.
The foul air, the morbid fauna, the disgusting terrain. Here lies my first mistake of my crusades. The essence of a god does not simply vanish when the body dies. It must be properly disposed of or destroyed entirely. Essence of a pious god could never fester into a mire as dreadful as this.
From the Crimson lore item, this instantly pops up a few questions. What exactly does Yharim mean when he says, "It must be properly disposed of or destroyed entirely"? Well, some of you, more familiar with basic lore, might be thinking, well, it must be wall of flesh, because killing it releases evil essences. And you'd be right, but that isn't what Yharim is talking about.
My methods have since evolved. I need not contain such essences when they can be devoured.
Ooh, new keyword unlocked, devoured. Well now, that's easy, you might be saying. And you'd be right again. It's Devourer of Gods, the flying trash can.
Capable of swallowing gods whole, absorbing their essence in its entirety.
It's also funny to note that though Yharim once believed that the essence he, Devourer of Gods, devours, is utterly and completely erased from existence. It is a fundamental rule of creation that energy cannot be destroyed. From the only unbiased source of information in the game, the bestiary. Anyway, away from that monster of a worm to a much smaller, much more pitiful one, the Eater of Worlds.
That thing devouring a planet. Ridiculous.
Yharim says, and I agree. This dude could barely devour me if he tried. Was I the only one who just recently noticed that the second evil biome bosses are kinda switched? The first set of bosses being a worm and a brain that spawns and teleports stuff, and the second set being a brain that spawns annoying stuff and a guy that spawns worms. Anyway, speaking of brains, the Brain of Cthulhu adds a bit onto something that I started last episode.
It is true that unspeakable abominations may now be commonplace, largely by my hand. Though they have always been a product of the folly of the gods, the same gods would cull them in equal measure.
A rare bit of Yharim recognizing his wrongdoings, and probably the last one you'll see for quite some time.
Some semblance of a god's mind may survive death, like the twitches of a crushed insect. What little remains attempts to convene, to coalesce in worship, so that its power may yet be restored. How pitiful.
And back to the hate with the hive mind lore item. But there's some interesting stuff here. Not only does a god's essence not die with them, gods, whether it be all gods or just the stronger willed, still have minds. You will notice minds, or consciousness, and souls are mentioned a lot in the lore. Everywhere from here to the mechs and astral infection in hard mode, it's a very hot topic of the mod.
Fortunately for us, the futility of this effort is unmatched. The biomass obeys, but nothing is accomplished.
This is actually quite similar to another enemy we'll get a lot further into soon, slimes. For now, this is all I'll give you. Slimes that have absorbed some of the blighted godly essence. Riddled with impurity, they are now more putrid flesh than gelatin, and having taken in such an amount that they seem ready to burst. Yet unlike most slimes which have relatively basic minds, these seem to be collecting mass with a purpose. From the Blight Slime bestiary entry, slimes are really interesting and have a surprising amount of dedicated lore, so we'll certainly touch on them later. Unfortunately for us, Draedon has nothing on the evil biomes, and thus a dry episode is born. But on the bright side, it's time for probably the most interesting evil biome member in my eyes, the Perforators and their hive. The lore item is actually the least interesting part, just more yapping. But the bestiary entries go hard today, to tear and consume, taking for only themselves until there is nothing left. This was the primal instinct left behind by the gods which now form the Crimson. Their selfish desires coalesced into this hive, infested by ravenous worms whose sole desire is to devour. This is creepy, but also cool as frick, and yet another example of consciousness being a staple of Calamity lore. It also gives us a clue to the Auric's soul the slain god absorbed. We know it can't be the Dragon of Gluttony's soul, as that belongs to somebody already, but we see the words tear, consume, and selfish. This might not strictly be pointing us to what domain the soul is. Pause. Draconic domains, not domain expansions, but draconic domains, are essentially what a dragon is linked to. For example, with some dragons we know exist, the Dragon of Light, the Dragon of Gluttony, the Dragon of Life, the Dragon of Rebirth. Depending on what Auric soul you absorb, you will get a different outcome. And if you're lucky enough, you can have something like Silva, where she was already very intrinsically linked with nature and life and absorbed the life dragon's Auric soul, essentially double boosting her amount of ability to live, I guess. Essentially, think of the draconic domain as what the dragon is linked to. This might not strictly be pointing us to what domain the soul is, but it's quite intriguing nonetheless. A living embodiment of some of the worst this world has to offer, these parasites made full use of their hive, using it to seek ever more to gorge themselves upon. They sought to grow even larger, that they may one day perhaps regain what they lost. Again, this does remind me a lot of slimes, and it implies that dead gods can perhaps come back. Uh-oh, foreshadowing. Now, there's probably more I could touch on, but I think I blabbered enough for one day. And if you're wondering why I ignored Desert Scourge, it's because the Calamity team is hard at work on the next update, the Sunken Sea Overhaul. With the Sunken Sea Overhaul comes a lot of new lore. And so, I'm waiting patiently for it to come out. In the meantime, if Calamity lore is at all interesting to you, you should certainly come over to the Calamity Discord, if you didn't come from there already, specifically the lore discussion channel, in which me and many others partake in very intellectual conversations. This has been Zele. I hope I taught you something new today, and I'll see you next time.